Imagine the following. You're a British pilot manning a sea vampire jet, and your whole goal is to land on a carrier without using your wheels. Might be relatively simple, however, the deck is not your regular carrier deck. It is made of flexible, bouncy rubber. This is the story of how the US and British navies tried using undercarriageless aircraft and bouncy rubber runways to try and create the aircraft carrier of the future. Spoiler, it wasn't the future. So you might be wondering why they would want to make the act of landing a plane on a carrier in the open sea even more daunting than the task already seems, but the logic behind it, though crazy in hindsight, the logic back then actually was relatively sound. Now we have to go back in time to World War II
It's rewind time.
to understand why some of the biggest navies in the world experimented with something that sounds so crazy. Not only the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, as well as the British attack on the Italian harbor of Taranto showed how deadly carrier planes could be. Now, the Japanese took that one step further on December 10th, 1941, just a couple days after Pearl Harbor, where granted they weren't carrier planes, but the Japanese sent 88 aircraft after a small British battle group. A couple hours later, the Japanese had lost 6-ish aircraft, of which 2 went missing. They lost about 18 men killed. On the British side of things, they lost the battlecruiser Repulse, the battleship Prince of Wales, and they lost over 800 men killed, again cementing just how powerful aircraft were in a battle against ships. So really by the end of World War II, it had become obvious that the era of the battleships was over, and the era of planes, or more so carrier-based planes, being able to strike basically everywhere you want in the world within a certain amount of hours, that era had just begun. So during the final stages of World War II, as well as after, design bureaus from all over the world wanted to try and incorporate this new jet technology into their future carrier-based plane designs. You have to keep in mind that jet engines at the time were very thirsty. They needed a lot of fuel to keep going, and that needed to be somewhere. Now, again, these jets had to be small because they had to fit on a contemporary carrier. So some genius came up with the crazy idea, what if we just remove the wheels and the space for them in the undercarriage of the plane, and it'll save us a bunch of weight? And the worst part about this crazy idea was, at the time, carrier landings were deemed to be quite dangerous, with landing gear collapsing or even landing gear striking against the carrier as they were coming in for a landing. So crazy enough, the contemporary thought was this actually might be safer. Yes, it might be a safer idea to land a plane without landing gear on a flexible rubber deck. I'm not making this up. That's a legit thought they had at the time. Some initial testing had been done, and they figured out that, hey, we can save about 5% of the plane's total weight by cutting the wheels and the undercarriage, and that's actually not bad. Now, designers said we can probably cut anywhere from another 5 to 10% by making the wings a little less fat, by just basing the entire design, like the Supermarine 505, around this wheelless design, and obviously the fact that they would land on these rubber runways. So a savings of 10 to 15% in weight just meant that a lot of people were like, hey, does this maybe not a crazy bad idea? Because so far they'd only seen this sort of potential benefits. But this was a two-pronged idea. Not only did you now have no wheels on the underside of a plane, the plane also had to land on a new type of runway. This couldn't just be a regular steel or concrete runway. It would damage the plane's fuselage too much. And that's the last thing you want to do, is spend a whole bunch of time repairing your planes after every time they land. So the idea was to have a rubber flexible type of runway, also called the carpet, which would be layered on top of pressurized fire hoses. Finally, the idea was that there wouldn't really be much wear and tear if the rubber carpet was kept dry, though it was hypothesized that, hey, if we keep it wet, it might be a little better on the minimal wear and tear that we're foreseeing. So really, it came down to the wetter, the better. On takeoff, they would still use a catapult to propel the plane off the carrier, and on recovery or landing, the plane would still have an arrestor hook to catch the cable, though there would only be one cable and not multiple, as we see now on modern carriers. Though obviously missing the wire happens sometimes, even nowadays with the best of pilots and the best sorts of technology that we have to offer, and it was said that, hey, worst case scenario, you miss that wire, you just bounce right off the deck, give her full throttle, and you just keep going and you try to come back around for another try. So all this testing really happened in the 40s and 50s, and originally the Americans had sent some observers as well as even one of their own test pilots to say, hey, why don't we go see what the crazy British people are up to with this like no wheels sort of bouncy castle runway. And they came up with their own idea after they, I guess, didn't totally dislike it. The Navy built their own sort of flexible runway on land made out of Goodyear rubber, very specifically. They even modified a couple of the US Navy's F9, F7 Cougars with a ventral bulge to really sort of help the bottom of the fuselage whenever it came into contact with the runway. Though after like 20-ish odd tests, the US Navy just said, this just wasn't worth all the time, effort, and money we put into it, and they canceled the rubber deck sort of wheelless plane idea. So with the test honestly going relatively well, no major casualties or even deaths have been reported as far as I could find, you might be wondering why we're not looking at like wheelless F-18s landing on a rubber deck Nimitz. The reason really comes down to the fact that the wheels were a little bit more important than they originally had thought. What a surprise. Having an aircraft with no wheels try to divert to say a regular runway or even a regular carrier is going to have major issues. It's not going to have this nice rubber bouncy castle landing deck, so they can't go anywhere unless you have special cranes and trolleys and carts. The average carrier or average runway isn't going to have a specialized cart or crane to move a jet that could weigh tons out of the way of its airstrip or carrier deck. At the time, the average recovery time for a normal wheeled plane was about 30 seconds, or like 2 every minute on a regular carrier. That's not actually a bad time. That's pretty decent. That's like 120 theoretical every hour. It was theorized by a head scientist at the British Naval Aircraft Department, or NAD, that they could recover these wheelless aircraft on rubber carrier decks about twice as fast. So when they started to get into the actual testing of this, they didn't hit 1 every 15, neither did they hit 1 every 30 seconds, which is what the regular carriers could do. It took them a whole of 300 seconds, or like 5 minutes, so they went from 120 regular to just 12 of these wheelless planes every hour, and that wasn't going to cut it. So they had to come up with some new ideas and solutions. And this solution actually came, and he kind of redeemed himself, because first this guy did say, hey, we can do 1 every 15 seconds, but he redeemed himself, and together with a officer of the Royal Navy, they basically designed what we now know as the angled deck concept, still in use like 70 plus years later and to this very day. Basically, a plane would land and then immediately be able to be shoved off to the side, allowing different planes to land and thus causing less of a 300-second wait and just trying to get closer to that magical 30-second difference between planes on a regular carrier. Now, jets were getting bigger, aircraft carriers were getting bigger, and the fact that these jets were getting bigger and heavier just meant that cutting the wheels or even kind of basing the entire design around the fact that it had no wheels just gave diminishing returns, and it wasn't worth the hassle on saving a smaller percentage of the aircraft's total weight. Furthermore, landing on a carrier is already considered to be quite a dangerous and difficult thing to do, and it wasn't really something that they were sure and confident of that the average Navy pilot,
I feel the need for speed.
which I assume are pretty well trained, and they just weren't sure that they could train these pilots accurately enough to snatch that one cable every single time. So flexible decks never really made it out of that prototype stage and never really was adopted by any Navy, but the angled deck, which sort of was born out of accident out of that, still very much so being used. In hindsight, from a 2023 perspective, I think landing a plane loaded with explosives, bombs, fuel, and ammo on a carrier without using your wheels, and also with the carrier having this bouncy castle structure, honestly seems like a really, really crazy bad idea, and I honestly think it really was. They still try it though. It is a crazy idea to land a jet loaded with fuel, bombs, rockets, loaded with air. Loaded with air, he said. Put that in a video. My dolphin edition for South Park.